What if I told you that in this state it was literally illegal for a grown adult to pump their own gas? A cult poisoned an entire town's salad bars just to win a local election. And the world's greatest hijacker jumped out of a plane here with $200,000, and the FBI never found him. And every single one of those is 100% real Oregon history? Welcome to 71 Dumbest Things from Oregon. That make no sense, where the facts are wilder than the fiction, every law is more absurd than the last, and nothing will ever make sense again. Subscribe right now, because we are starting immediately, and you cannot afford to miss fact number 50. 1. Oregon had a law so bizarre that even gas station attendants could not believe it was real. From 1951 all the way until 2018, it was actually a crime for any Oregon driver to pump their own gas, punishable by a $500 fine. Regular Americans in every other state had been filling their own tanks for decades, while Oregonians sat in their cars waiting for someone else to do it. For them, like royalty who never learned to adult. 2. Deep inside the Blue Mountains of Oregon lives something so enormous and so ancient that it makes every skyscraper on Earth look like a toddler's toy. A single honey fungus stretches across 2,385 acres underground, quietly existing as the largest living organism on the entire planet. Scientists estimate this one fungus is around 8,000 years old, meaning it was already ancient when the Egyptian pyramids were still being built and no one in Oregon even noticed it was there. 3. In 1984, a religious cult in rural Oregon pulled off something so disturbing it rewrote American history books forever. Followers of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh walked into salad bars across Wasco County and deliberately contaminated the food with salmonella bacteria, making 751 innocent people violently ill. It was the first bioterrorism attack ever carried out on American soil, and it happened not in some major city, but in quiet small-town Oregon, where nobody ever expected anything remotely that sinister to unfold on a Tuesday afternoon. 4. Phil Knight did not launch Nike from some fancy Silicon Valley office or a sleek downtown headquarters. He launched it from the trunk of his car at a Portland track meet in 1964, selling Japanese running shoes to athletes who had no idea they were buying from a future billionaire. Knight had 0 stores, 0 staff, and 0 marketing budget. He just opened his trunk, laid out the shoes, and started talking. That scrappy little car trunk operation eventually became the most recognizable sportswear brand on the entire planet. 5. Oregon sits on a fact so nutty, it sounds completely made up until you actually look it up. This one state grows 99% of every single hazelnut produced anywhere in the United States, making it the absolute undisputed hazelnut capital of North America. Every can of Nutella, every holiday mixed nut bag, and every fancy chocolate hazelnut truffle sold across America almost certainly started its life as a tiny nut growing quietly in an Oregon orchard that most Americans could not locate on a map. 6. Oregon has a law on its books so old and so ridiculous that most legal scholars laugh the moment they hear it. Back in 1850, Oregon legislators decided it should be technically illegal to whisper dirty words anywhere near a church. That law was never repealed, never challenged, and never removed meaning. It is still sitting there in Oregon legal code right now. Somewhere across Oregon today, someone is probably standing outside a church completely unaware. They are one whispered curse word away from technically breaking a 170-year-old law. 7. Most Americans assume their mainland soil was never bombed by a foreign enemy during World War II, and they are completely wrong. In September 1942, a Japanese incendiary balloon bomb drifted across the Pacific and landed near Brookings, Oregon, killing 6 civilians and making it the only place on continental American soil ever struck by a foreign attack during the entire war. A quiet Oregon forest became a war zone for one terrible morning while the rest of the country had absolutely no idea it was even happening. 8. Crater Lake in Oregon looks like something a computer generated for a fantasy movie because no real lake should be that impossibly deep or that perfectly still. At 1,943 feet, it is the deepest lake in the entire United States, and the truly strange part is that not a single river flows into it or out of it. The whole lake filled up entirely from rain and snowfall, alone over thousands of years sitting there completely self-contained, like nature decided to build its own private swimming pool. 9. Coos Bay. Oregon produced a runner so dominant and so fierce that the entire American distance running record book belonged to him simultaneously. Steve Prefontaine held every single American record from 2,000 meters all the way up to 10,000 meters at the same time, a feat no American athlete has ever come close to matching. He was bold, he was loud, and he ran like the finish line personally offended him. Then he died in a car crash at just 24 years old, and American running never fully recovered from losing him. 10. In 1971, a man bought a plane ticket, hijacked the aircraft mid-flight, collected $200,000 in ransom, strapped on a parachute, and jumped into the dark Oregon wilderness never to be seen again. D.B. Cooper became the only person in all of American aviation history to pull off an unsolved air piracy and disappear completely. The FBI chased leads for decades, found a few soggy bills on a riverbank, and officially gave up in 2016. Nobody knows who he was, where he landed, or whether he even survived that jump. 11. Oregon did something in the year 2000 that made every politician in Washington, D.C. shake their head and call it a dangerous experiment. Oregon became the first state in America to conduct all its elections entirely by mail, letting every single voter cast their ballot from their kitchen table. Every expert said it would fail, every critic said it would invite fraud, and every skeptic waited for the disaster that never came. Then those same critics quietly went home and started adopting versions of the exact same system they had just spent years mocking. 12. Oregon has a coastline stretching 363 miles of some of the most dramatic ocean scenery anywhere in America, and not a single private individual owns 1 inch of it. Since 1913, every beach, every cliff, every tide pool, and every sandy stretch along the entire Oregon Pacific coast has been legally guaranteed as public property forever. No billionaire can fence it off. No corporation can build a private resort blocking access, and no politician has ever successfully changed it despite several quietly trying over the decades. 13. Oregon outlaw Harry Tracy decided in 1902 that getting caught was simply not something he was willing to accept under any circumstances whatsoever. After breaking out of prison, Tracy led hundreds of armed lawmen on a chase across Oregon and Washington for 60 straight days, becoming the most wanted man in the entire Pacific Northwest. He outsmarted posses, stole food from farmhouses, and charmed locals who secretly found him fascinating. He finally died alone in a wheat field, cornered at last, refusing even then to surrender without a fight. 14. Most Americans mow their lawn every weekend without once stopping to wonder where that grass actually came from originally. The answer for nearly 90% of all grass seed grown in the United States is a single valley in Oregon. The Willamette Valley quietly produces the overwhelming majority of America's entire grass seed supply, meaning suburban lawns, from Florida to Maine, almost certainly started their life as a tiny seed sitting in an Oregon field that most homeowners have never once thought about or appreciated. 15. Portland, Oregon takes its love of books so seriously, it makes every other American city look like it barely learned to read. Portland has more bookstores per resident than any other city in the entire country, and its crown jewel Powell's Books occupies a full city block downtown, stocking over 1 million individual volumes. Locals treat Powell's less like a bookstore and more like a sacred civic institution, the kind of place where people walk in planning to spend 20 minutes and emerge 4 hours later carrying bags they cannot afford. 16. During World War II, Oregon's Kaiser shipyards in Portland accomplished something so fast it made the entire global shipbuilding industry stop and stare in absolute disbelief. Workers launched a fully completed Liberty ship in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, setting a world speed record for shipbuilding that has never been broken by anyone anywhere on Earth since. Regular working men and women in Portland built an entire ocean-going vessel faster than most people complete a home renovation, and the record still stands untouched today. 17. American beach culture, the swimsuits, the style, the whole sun-soaked aesthetic has roots that trace directly back to a rowing club in Portland, Oregon in 1910. The Jansen swimwear brand started simply because a local rowing team needed better wool swimsuits that actually worked in cold water. What began as a practical fix for shivering rowers became a nationally recognized brand that defined how Americans dressed at the beach for decades. all because some Portland athletes were tired of being cold and uncomfortable on the water. 18. Oregon holds a weather record that its residents find deeply unfunny and their therapists find extremely profitable. Portland averages just 144 sunny days per year, which is actually fewer sunny days than notoriously gray and gloomy. Seattle gets annually. Oregon leads the entire United States in seasonal affective disorder cases, meaning more Oregonians suffer from depression driven by lack of sunlight than residents of any other state. The clouds roll in, the rain starts, and a significant portion of the population quietly begins counting days until summer arrives. 19. When the U.S. government forced Japanese Americans into internment camps during World War II, Oregon enforced the policy with a particular cruelty that left lasting generational damage. Farming families who had spent decades building successful agricultural operations had their land permanently seized while they were imprisoned behind barbed wire. When the war ended and the camps closed, most Oregon families returned to find their property gone, their farms transferred to other owners, and the legal system offering them virtually no path to recover what had been taken from them. 20. Oregon entered the Union in 1859 carrying a stain so ugly that even other states found it uncomfortable to acknowledge openly. Oregon's original state constitution contained an explicit clause banning black people from living within state borders entirely, one of the most blatant racial exclusion laws ever written into an American state's founding document. That shameful clause was not removed from Oregon's books until 1926, nearly 60 years after the Civil War ended, meaning Oregon spent 6 decades as an officially whites-only state, hiding behind legal language. 21. Oregon has more ghost towns scattered across its landscape than any other state in the entire American West, and most of them died the same lonely death. Over 200 completely abandoned settlements sit empty across Oregon today. Hollow leftovers from mining booms that went bust and timber operations that collapsed overnight. These towns had schools, saloons, post offices, and families with real lives and real plans. Then the money dried up, the industry vanished, and everyone simply packed their belongings and walked away, leaving entire communities to slowly rot in silence. 22. Salem, Oregon. In the late 1960s had a serial killer living quietly among its residents, and nobody had the faintest idea. Jerome Brudos worked as an electrician, lived in a normal house, waved at neighbors, and was described by everyone who knew him as completely unremarkable and forgettable in every possible way. While maintaining that perfectly ordinary exterior, Brudos was committing murders so disturbing they became case study material in FBI training programs for decades. The most frightening part was not what he did, but how invisible and normal he managed to appear while doing it. 23. Oregon produces a Pinot Noir so exceptional that it accomplished something the French wine establishment finds genuinely humiliating to discuss publicly. Burgundy winemakers, the most proudly territorial vintners on the entire planet, sat through blind tastings and admitted that Oregon Pinot Noir beat their own wines. French vintners, who had spent centuries insisting their region produced the only serious Pinot Noir on Earth, quietly acknowledged that a rainy American state nobody considered a serious wine region had somehow beaten them at their own centuries-old game without anyone seeing it coming. 24. In 1970, Oregon Governor Tom McCall did something no American governor before or since has ever attempted with a straight face. Facing the prospect of massive anti-war protests disrupting President Nixon's visit to Portland, McCall secretly organized an entire rock festival in Clackamas County to distract demonstrators and keep them occupied miles away from the president. The state government funded, organized, and promoted a music festival purely as a crowd control strategy, making it the only government-sponsored rock festival in the entire history of the United States of America. 25. When the Civil War tore America apart and the Union desperately needed every soldier it could find, Oregon sent the smallest contribution of any Union state in the entire conflict. Just 1,810 soldiers came from Oregon, a number so low it raised serious alarm in Washington, D.C. The federal government was genuinely worried that Confederate sympathizers within Oregon's population were strong enough to potentially pull the state away from the Union entirely, making Oregon one of the most politically uncertain states on the northern side of the entire war. 26. Weyerhaeuser. Timber Company once controlled so much of rural Oregon that calling it a corporation barely captures what it actually was in practical terms. The company built its own private roads that public citizens could not use, constructed its own private towns where workers lived entirely on company property, and employed its own private law enforcement that answered to corporate leadership rather than elected government. Entire Oregon counties functioned less like parts of a democratic state, and more like privately owned territories where one corporation made every meaningful decision affecting thousands of people's daily lives. 27. Along the Columbia River in Oregon sits a Cold War legacy so toxic and so expensive that it makes every other environmental cleanup project in American history look manageable by comparison. The Hanford site is officially the single most contaminated nuclear facility in the entire Western Hemisphere, a direct result of decades of plutonium production during the Cold War that left the surrounding landscape saturated with radioactive waste. American taxpayers currently spend over $2 billion every single year just trying to manage the contamination, and experts estimate the cleanup will not be finished for decades. 28. Before Oregon got involved, Americans who ran for fun were considered eccentric at best and genuinely strange at worst. In 1966, Oregon cardiologist Waldo Harris, along with University of Oregon coaching staff, introduced the concept of jogging as a legitimate public fitness activity to American culture. Regular people running through neighborhoods for exercise was a foreign and mildly alarming concept to most Americans at the time. Oregon essentially invented the idea that ordinary citizens should run for their health, and then watched that idea spread across the entire country until it became completely unavoidable. 29. Oregon picked a fight with the federal government in 1997 over one of the most emotionally charged issues in American medicine and refused to back down for nearly a decade. Oregon became the first state to legalize physician-assisted suicide, giving terminally ill patients the legal right to end their lives on their own terms with medical supervision. Washington, D.C. fought it furiously, challenged it repeatedly, and dragged the battle all the way to the Supreme Court. In 2006, the Supreme Court ruled against the federal government, and Oregon's law stood completely intact. 30. Most Americans can describe the Grand Canyon in detail without ever having visited it, but almost none of them have heard of the canyon that is actually deeper. Hell's Canyon along Oregon's border with Idaho drops 7,913 feet, making it deeper than the Grand Canyon by a significant and embarrassing margin. Yet Hell's Canyon receives a tiny fraction of the visitors, the attention, and the national recognition that the Grand Canyon commands every single year. Oregon has the deeper canyon and somehow lost the marketing battle so completely it is not even close. 31. Oregon voters in 1902 sent a man to the United States Senate who was actively under federal indictment for land fraud at the exact moment they elected him. John H. Mitchell took his Senate seat in Washington, D.C., continued conducting official government business, and was then convicted of the very crimes he had been accused of while voters sent him there. Mitchell received a prison sentence while still holding his Senate seat and responded to the entire situation by simply refusing to resign, serving as a convicted felon in the United States Senate without a hint of shame. 32. A small group of dairy farmers on the Oregon coast in 1909 decided to pool their milk together, rather than compete against each other, and accidentally built one of the most recognizable cheese brands in American history. Tillamook Creamery now processes over 1.7 billion pounds of milk every single year and outsells every competing cheese brand west of the Mississippi River. What started as a practical survival strategy among struggling coastal farmers became a billion-dollar operation that turned a tiny Oregon town's name into something millions of American grocery shoppers recognize instantly without thinking twice. 33. Portland, Oregon adopted the slogan, "Keep Portland Weird," with such fierce ownership and such aggressive civic pride that most Portlanders genuinely believe their city invented the phrase from scratch. The truth is considerably more embarrassing for Portland's sense of originality. The slogan was lifted directly from Austin, Texas in 2003, where it had already been in active use. Portland took another city's identity rallying cry, plastered it on bumper stickers and t-shirts across the entire metro area, and proceeded to act as though the concept of weirdness itself had been born exclusively within city limits. 34. During Prohibition, Oregon's Pacific coastline became one of the most aggressively lawless stretches of water anywhere in the entire United States. Rum-running operations along the Oregon coast grew so extensive and so organized that the U.S. Coast Guard recorded more armed gunboat chases in Oregon waters than anywhere else along the entire Pacific. Bootleggers knew the rocky coves, the foggy nights, and the isolated beaches better than any federal agent ever could. Oregon's coastline essentially became a floating black market, and the Coast Guard spent years losing a cat-and-mouse game against people who knew every inch of the water. 35. Sam Walton gets credit for inventing the American Superstore concept, but the actual blueprint for everything Walmart became was already operating in Portland, Oregon, nearly 2 decades before Walton opened his first store. Fred Meyer launched his megastore in Portland in 1931, combining groceries, clothing, hardware, and pharmacy, all under one enormous roof, the exact model that Walmart would later use to conquer American retail. Walton studied the concept, refined it, and built a global empire, while Fred Meyer became a regional brand that history quietly forgot to credit for starting the whole thing. 36. Oregon leads the entire United States in one particular statistic that churches, mosques, and synagogues across the country find deeply unsettling. Over 40% of Oregon residents claim absolutely no religious identity or affiliation of any kind, making it the most secular state in the entire nation by a considerable margin. No other American state comes close to Oregon's level of collective religious disengagement. Oregonians are not quietly spiritual or privately faithful in unaffiliated ways either. They are simply and straightforwardly done with organized religion at a rate that makes the rest of America genuinely uncomfortable to contemplate. 37. The NBA has changed its rules for many reasons over the decades, but changing them specifically to neutralize one Oregon player is a distinction that belongs entirely to Mel Counts. Counts stood 7 feet tall and played for Oregon State with such dominance near the basket that NBA officials rewrote the goaltending rules in 1966 specifically to limit what a player of his size and positioning could legally do during a game. A single Oregon college player was so disruptive to professional basketball's existing framework that the entire league changed its official rulebook rather than figure out how to defend him normally. 38. Oregon voters were not interested in being told what they could and could not drink, and they made that position aggressively clear on 3 separate occasions before the federal government overruled them entirely. Oregon rejected prohibition 3 different times through state votes, stubbornly refusing to ban alcohol while neighboring states fell in line one after another. It took a constitutional amendment to the entire United States Constitution to finally force Oregon to stop drinking legally. Even then, based on the rum-running activity that followed, a significant portion of Oregon's population treated federal law as a mild inconvenience rather than an actual rule. 39. Eastern Oregon hides a desert so dry and so dramatically isolated that it feels less like part of the Pacific Northwest and more like a landscape from another planet entirely. The Alvord Desert sits in the complete rain shadow of Steens Mountain and can go over 300 consecutive days without receiving a single measurable drop of rain. This extreme arid stretch exists just hours from Oregon's famously wet and green western side, meaning Oregon somehow contains both one of the rainiest regions and one of the driest patches of land in the entire Pacific Northwest simultaneously. 40. Oregon became an official American state in 1859 and immediately celebrated by letting 2 of its politicians settle a land dispute the old-fashioned way with pistols at dawn. The last officially recorded duel in Oregon history happened that very same year near Portland. 2 grown elected officials who could not resolve their disagreement through conversation or courts deciding that shooting at each other in the early morning light was the most reasonable available solution. Oregon entered American statehood, and within the same calendar year, reminded everyone that civilization in the Pacific Northwest was still very much a work in progress. 41. Oregon gave the entire United States its canned salmon industry, and most Americans have been benefiting from that decision without knowing it for over a century. The first successful commercial salmon cannery in all of North America opened on the Columbia River in Oregon in 1867, and immediately triggered a food industry revolution that spread across the continent. That single Oregon operation launched a canning movement that fed the entire United States for over 80 years, putting affordable protein on American tables from coast to coast, while the Columbia River quietly supplied the raw material that made it all possible. 42. McMinnville, Oregon hosts an annual UFO festival that attracts more true believers per capita than Roswell, New Mexico, the town that essentially invented the American UFO tourism industry. The whole obsession traces back to a 1950 photograph taken by a local farmer that captured something in the sky, the U.S. Air Force has studied repeatedly and never once conclusively explained to anyone's satisfaction. Decades of official investigation, multiple analyses, and endless government review later. And that Oregon farm photograph still sits unresolved in the files, drawing thousands of hopeful visitors to a small Oregon town every single year. 43. During World War II, the U.S. Army built a training facility in Oregon, so enormous it dwarfed the entire civilian city sitting right next to it. Camp Adair, at its peak, housed 40,000 soldiers on active duty, a population larger than the entire city of Corvallis, which sat directly adjacent to the camp's borders. Corvallis residents essentially lived next door to a military city bigger than their own, watching tens of thousands of soldiers train daily just beyond the fence line while their own town carried on with normal life in the shadow of a temporary military metropolis. 44. Columbia Sportswear was a failing Oregon company on the edge of total financial collapse in 1970, when a 68-year-old grandmother named Gert Boyle stepped in and refused to let it die. Boyle took over the struggling operation, rebuilt it from the ground up with zero prior corporate experience, and transformed it into a global outdoor apparel brand worth billions of dollars. She ran the company with a sharp wit and an iron will, becoming one of the most unlikely corporate turnaround stories in American business history, and proving that a determined Oregon grandmother could outperform entire rooms full of professional executives. 45. Portland receives winter rainstorms so catastrophically intense that comparing them to other famous rainy cities makes those cities sound practically sunny by reasonable standards. A single Portland atmospheric river event can dump more total water in 48 hours than the entire city of London receives over a full calendar month. Despite living under this genuinely extreme rainfall, Portlanders have developed a cultural rule against carrying umbrellas, treating the act of using one as an immediate and visible sign that someone is obviously a tourist who does not understand how real Pacific Northwest residents are supposed to endure their weather. 46. The 1948 Olympic Games in London featured something that had never happened before in American sports history, and has never been repeated since in quite the same way. The University of Oregon's basketball team traveled to London intact as a complete unit and represented the entire United States at the Olympics, winning the gold medal as a team that had built its chemistry together on one college campus. Oregon became the first American state whose university team, playing together exactly as they did at home, stood on an Olympic podium and accepted gold medals on behalf of the whole nation. 47. Oregon looked at the billboard industry in 1971 and made a decision that the American advertising world found both offensive and incomprehensible. The state banned billboards along all state highways entirely and permanently, joining just 3 other states in America willing to make that commitment to keeping their roadsides visually clean. No towering fast food signs, no lawyer advertisements, no giant mattress sale banners interrupting the landscape. Oregon drivers travel through scenery that looks the way it looked before advertising discovered the American roadside, and the billboard industry has spent decades unsuccessfully trying to reverse a ban that Oregon has never once seriously reconsidered. 48. The Columbia River Gorge in Oregon performs a meteorological trick so extreme that standing on one side of it and looking across feels like observing 2 completely different climates from a single viewpoint. Over just 80 miles, the gorge drops 4,000 feet in elevation, creating microclimates so drastically different that the western side receives 35 inches of annual rainfall while the eastern side receives just 12 inches. Rainforest conditions and near-desert conditions exist within the same dramatic landscape, separated by a stretch of river that acts as one of nature's most dramatic and abrupt weather-dividing lines. 49. Eastern Oregon's remote trails once served as smuggling routes for one of the Old West's most documented cattle rustling operations, tied directly to a woman history recorded as Cattle Kate. Kate Watson moved stolen cattle through Eastern Oregon's isolated backcountry routes before her story ended violently when she was hanged in Wyoming after ranchers decided the legal system was moving too slowly for their satisfaction. Her operations stretched across multiple states, and Oregon's eastern landscape served as both a hiding ground and a transit corridor for livestock that had been stolen from ranchers who eventually ran completely out of patience waiting for justice. 50. Almost every packet of wasabi served in American restaurants is completely fake, and the only place in the continental United States actually growing the real thing is Oregon. Authentic wasabi, the genuine Japanese horseradish that requires specific cold mountain water conditions to grow properly, is commercially cultivated in Oregon and almost nowhere else in the country. Every green paste sitting in a tiny plastic packet at a sushi counter across America is almost certainly dyed horseradish and mustard powder, pretending to be something it is not. While real wasabi grows quietly in Oregon streams that provide exactly the cold, pure water the plant demands. 51. Oregon's state legislature made a decision in 2013 that was either a stroke of genius or the clearest possible sign that craft beer had completely taken over the state's collective brain. Oregon officially designated Saccharomyces cerevisiae, common brewer's yeast, as the official state microbe, the first state in America to even have an official state microbe and naturally choosing the organism most responsible for producing beer. While other states were naming birds and flowers and fish as their official symbols, Oregon's government sat down, had what was probably a very enjoyable meeting, and decided their defining microbe was the one that makes alcohol. 52. Fort Stevens on the Oregon coast holds a military distinction so strange and so specific that most American history textbooks mention it only briefly before moving on, without fully appreciating how remarkable it actually was. In June 1942, a Japanese submarine surfaced off the Oregon coast and began shelling the fort, making it the only American military installation fired upon by a foreign enemy since the War of 1812. The truly extraordinary part was the American commander's response. He looked at the incoming shells, assessed the situation, and ordered his men to hold their fire and not return a single shot. 53. Oregon's timber industry was not merely important to the state's economy during its peak decades. It essentially was the economy for enormous stretches of rural Oregon. Then, the 1980s arrived and the industry collapsed with a speed and totality that left entire communities with nothing. Mill towns lost 90% of their population in under a decade as sawmills closed, logging operations ceased, and the economic foundation beneath whole communities simply evaporated. Historians studying regional economic collapses consider Oregon's timber industry implosion the fastest and most complete destruction of any single industry's regional dominance in modern American economic history. 54. Bend, Oregon spent 3 consecutive decades growing faster than almost any other mid-sized city in the entire United States and somehow managed to do it without anything resembling an actual plan. The city transformed from a quiet timber town of 17,000 residents into a city of 100,000 people, while local government scrambled to build roads, schools, and infrastructure fast enough to keep pace with growth that nobody had adequately prepared for or anticipated. Bend essentially became a boom town in slow motion, attractive enough to draw tens of thousands of new residents and completely unprepared for what that many new people actually required. 55. Eugene, Oregon secured something in 2022 that the entire global track and field community had been waiting 40 years to see happen on American soil. The World Athletics Championships came to Eugene, the first time in the event's 4-decade history it had ever been held in the United States. The location was not chosen randomly or politically. Eugene was selected specifically because the international athletics community regards it as the spiritual and cultural home of the sport. A small Oregon city that produced enough running legends and enough passionate track culture to earn that distinction from the entire world. 56. Oregon handed its ordinary citizens an amount of direct political power in 1902 that professional politicians found genuinely threatening to their comfortable grip on state government. The initiative petition system Oregon adopted that year allowed regular citizens to write their own laws and put them directly to a public vote, completely bypassing the state legislature if they gathered enough signatures. The concept was so radical and so effective at transferring power away from elected officials that it became the global template for direct democracy legislation, copied by governments around the world who wanted to give citizens meaningful control over their own laws. 57. Oregon's rivers hide a biological secret so impressive that scientists studying freshwater ecosystems treat the state as one of the most important research destinations in the entire country. Oregon contains more species of native freshwater fish than any state east of the Rocky Mountains, a level of aquatic biodiversity that researchers have spent decades studying without fully cataloging everything living in Oregon's river systems. The rivers that Oregonians fish, kayak, and raft across every summer contain biological complexity and species variety that most Americans would find shocking if they ever stopped to consider what was swimming beneath the surface. 58. The last successful train robbery in American history did not happen in the Wild West era of Jesse James or Butch Cassidy. It happened in Oregon in 1923 when the D'Outremont brothers planted explosives in a mail car tunnel in the Siskiyou Mountains, blew the car apart, killed 4 people, and escaped into the mountains with the confidence of men who believed they had committed the perfect crime. They had not. A 4-year international manhunt tracked them across multiple continents before all 3 brothers were eventually captured, and Oregon closed the final chapter of American train robbery history. 59. The Pendleton Roundup began in 1910 as a regional rodeo in a small eastern Oregon town and grew into the most celebrated and most culturally significant rodeo event in the entire American West. What made Pendleton genuinely distinctive was its deep and authentic connection to the Umatilla tribe, whose members participated in numbers that no other rodeo in the country came close to matching. The Roundup was not just a cowboy spectacle. It became a genuine cultural meeting point where Native American tradition and frontier rodeo culture existed together in a way that made Pendleton unlike any other rodeo event in America. 60. Oregon holds an annual river race so delightfully absurd that the rules alone are enough to make anyone question what exactly is in the Willamette River water. Since 1979, competitors have raced bathtubs down the Willamette River, and the event comes with one non-negotiable requirement that separates genuine competitors from casual participants. Every racer must consume a full cup of tea at some point during the race to officially qualify for crossing the finish line. No tea, no official finish. Oregon looked at the concept of competitive river racing, decided it needed more bathtubs and mandatory hot beverages, and never once reconsidered. 61. Astoria, Oregon sits at the mouth of the Columbia River as the oldest American settlement west of the Rocky Mountains, and it came extraordinarily close to flying a British flag permanently. In 1818, the United States Congress held a vote to determine whether Astoria would remain American territory or pass into British hands, and the entire future of America's Pacific Northwest presence was decided by a margin of just 3 votes. 3 congressmen voting differently on a single afternoon in 1818 could have handed Britain the entire Oregon coast and rewritten the map of North America completely. 62. Oregon made American tax history in 1929 by becoming the first state in the entire country to impose a state income tax on its residents, and immediately discovered that residents were not remotely interested in accepting that development quietly. The political backlash was so immediate, so fierce, and so sustained that it consumed 3 consecutive Oregon governors whose careers were effectively ended by the endless fighting over whether the tax should exist at all. Oregon pioneered state income taxation and then spent years watching its own political class destroy itself, arguing over the consequences of a decision that was already legally done and completely irreversible. 63. Hidden inside the Oregon Caves in Josephine County is a geological formation so rare that finding it anywhere on Earth is considered a significant scientific event worth documenting carefully. The caves contain moon milk, a soft white bacterial mineral deposit with a texture unlike anything else found in standard cave environments. Moon milk exists in fewer than a dozen cave systems anywhere in the entire world, and Oregon has it sitting quietly in a southern cave system that most Oregonians have never visited and most Americans have never heard of. despite it being one of the genuinely rarest natural formations on the planet. 64. Norm Van Brocklin grew up in Oregon and went on to do something on a professional football field in 1951 that nobody has ever managed to fully replicate in the decades since. Playing for the Los Angeles Rams, Van Brocklin threw for 554 passing yards in a single NFL game, setting a single game record that stood completely unbroken for 51 consecutive years. Quarterbacks with better rosters, better receivers, and better technology have chased that number for over half a century, and Oregon's Van Brocklin has simply refused to let go of a record he set before most current NFL players were even born. 65. Oregon stepped into territory no American state had entered before in 2020 by becoming the first state to decriminalize personal possession of small amounts of every hard drug simultaneously. The decision made Oregon a national flashpoint immediately, drawing fierce praise from reform advocates and equally fierce condemnation from law enforcement across the country. Then reality arrived. Public disorder increased. The situation became complicated in ways supporters had not fully anticipated, and by 2024, Oregon was partially reversing the very law it had passed with such historic confidence just 4 years earlier, giving the rest of America a complicated and unresolved case study to argue about indefinitely. 66. Wheeler County, Oregon contains a landscape so visually impossible that first-time visitors frequently stop their cars and simply stand there trying to process what their eyes are actually showing them. The Painted Hills contain rock layers deposited 33 million years ago when Oregon was a subtropical forest floor, compressed over geological time into vivid red, gold, and black striped formations that look painted by hand rather than formed by nature. Nothing else in North America looks remotely like the Painted Hills, and the fact that this extraordinary landscape sits in a county most Americans cannot locate on a map makes it one of Oregon's most spectacular secrets. 67. Oregon's 1902 public land fraud scandal was not a small corruption story involving a few greedy officials cutting quiet backroom deals. It was a coordinated criminal enterprise so vast it simultaneously implicated a sitting United States senator, a sitting United States congressman, and the Oregon state land agent all at the same time. 3 senior government officials working in concert to steal public land made it the largest and most brazen coordinated government corruption case ever prosecuted in the American West. A scandal that exposed how thoroughly Oregon's political establishment had decided public land was simply there for powerful men to take. 68. Pendleton Woolen Mills has operated in Oregon since 1909 and spent over a century doing something that almost no American manufacturer can honestly claim anymore. The same original factory building that opened over 115 years ago is still standing, still operating, and still producing wool blankets on the same Oregon site. During World War I, World War II, and the Korean War, the U.S. Army turned to Pendleton for the wool blankets soldiers needed in the field. 3 wars, 3 generations of American soldiers, and 1 Oregon mill that kept showing up every single time the country needed it most. 69. Crater Lake in Oregon produces a shade of blue so vivid, so unnaturally perfect, and so relentlessly consistent that the first European settlers who encountered it refused to trust their own eyes. The blue is not a trick of light or a seasonal variation. It is that color every single day, produced by the extraordinary purity and depth of water that has never been touched by river sediment or agricultural runoff. Early settlers stared at the lake, debated among themselves for years, and seriously argued over whether someone had artificially colored the water because nature simply did not seem capable of producing something that looked that deliberately perfect. 70. Oregon's fishing industry in the early 20th century grew powerful enough to do something that sounds completely implausible for a single American state to accomplish from a small city on the Pacific coast. Oregon cannery owners operating out of Portland offices colluded openly to control the price of canned salmon for the entire Western world, setting global commodity prices from conference rooms in a Pacific Northwest city that most of the world could not locate on a map. Oregon did not just dominate American salmon, it held the pricing lever for an international market and pulled it with the confidence of people who knew nobody could stop them. 71. Lithia Park in Ashland, Oregon, is one of the most beautifully designed public spaces in the entire Pacific Northwest, and almost nobody who visits it knows the name of the man who created it. John McLaren designed Lithia Park in 1914, laying out its paths, plantings, and landscape with the same careful artistry he applied to his most famous project. McLaren was the same landscape architect who designed San Francisco's Golden Gate Park, one of the most celebrated public spaces in American history. One man shaped two iconic parks in two different states, and most visitors to both have never once heard his name mentioned. Oregon just proved that every single American state is hiding facts so dumb, so bizarre, and so genuinely unbelievable that nobody taught you any of this in school. Which one of these blew your mind completely? Drop it in the comments right now and tell us. If you survived all 71 facts without your brain breaking, hit that like button, subscribe to Dumbest Things, and stay ready because we are coming for every single state on the map next.